Hi there, my name is James, and welcome to our channel. Here we dive deep into true crime stories that reveal the darkest secrets and most shocking cases. If you enjoy gripping stories about real-life mysteries and investigations, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Now let's get into today's story. On a quiet August night in 2017, 22-year-old Grace Wilkins found herself face-to-face with a nightmare she never saw coming. Her mother, Emma, had recently passed away, leaving her devastated. But in the weeks that followed, Grace began to notice unsettling things, strange noises, eerie visions, and a growing sense of unease that pointed toward her stepfather, Paul Barnett. What started as grief soon turned into suspicion, and Grace began to wonder, was her mother's death truly a natural event, or was there something far darker at play? Grace Wilkins was not only dealing with the loss of her mother, but also facing unsettling clues that suggested her stepfather knew more than he was letting on. Emma Wilkins's death, officially ruled as a heart attack, left no one asking questions, no one except Grace. In today's video, we'll follow the journey of a daughter who sought the truth, uncovering shocking revelations that would change everything. Was Emma Wilkins's death an accident, or did her life end by design? Stay with us as we unravel this disturbing case. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories and let us know what you think of the case in the comments below. Ashford, Oregon was the kind of town where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Nestled between tall green mountains and thick evergreen forests, Ashford had a small population of just over 3,000 people. It was quiet and peaceful, and everyone knew each other. The local diner was always filled with familiar faces, and the streets were lined with cozy houses that hadn't changed much over the years. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect town, a tragedy was about to unfold. Grace Wilkins, a 22-year-old psychology student at Willamette University, had always been close to her mother, Emma. They were more like best friends than mother and daughter. Emma was a local artist, known for her bright, colorful paintings that decorated homes and galleries all over town. She was lively, warm, and always full of energy. Grace admired her mother and depended on her, especially after her father had passed away when she was just a child. Everything seemed to change 3 years earlier when Emma married Paul Barnett, a quiet man in his mid-40s who worked as a financial consultant. Paul seemed to fit into their small family at first. He was reserved but polite, and he treated Emma well, or so it seemed. Grace accepted him, though they were never particularly close. But on July 2017, Emma's sudden death shattered Grace's world. Emma was only 42 years old when she died, and the official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. It was unexpected and devastating, leaving Grace feeling completely alone. Paul, however, seemed to handle it differently, almost too calmly. While Grace was heartbroken, Paul was composed, even distant. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the days turned into weeks, that sense of unease grew, and Grace began to question everything she thought she knew about her stepfather. In the weeks following her mother's death, Grace couldn't ignore the unsettling changes around her. While she was drowning in grief, Paul's behavior became more and more peculiar. He wasn't grieving the way Grace expected. There were no tears, no moments of vulnerability, just an eerie calmness that hung over him like a shadow. At first, Grace thought it was just his way of coping. But as time passed, that calmness started to feel more like cold detachment. Paul took control of the household almost immediately. He handled all of Emma's affairs, her will, the finances, and even the sale of her artwork, without consulting Grace. While she was trying to process her loss, Paul seemed more focused on practical matters. He even suggested that Grace should see a therapist, subtly implying that she wasn't coping well with the loss. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that his concern was more about keeping her quiet than helping her heal. Then came the noises. Late at night, Grace would hear footsteps echoing down the hall, even though Paul was asleep in his room. Doors creaked open on their own, and sometimes, in the stillness of the night, Grace thought she heard whispering, so faint that she couldn't make out the words, but clear enough to leave her on edge. The most disturbing moment came on August 2nd, just days after the funeral. Grace was woken in the middle of the night, 3:14 a.m. to be exact, by a strange sensation. When she opened her eyes, she saw her mother standing at the foot of her bed. Emma's figure wasn't angry or menacing, but there was a sadness in her expression. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Grace was frozen, her heart pounding, as her mother pointed down the hall toward Paul's room before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, Grace tried to tell Paul about the vision, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But Paul's response was cold and dismissive. "You're grieving, Grace," he said flatly. "Your mind is playing tricks on you." He suggested again that she see a therapist, his eyes calm and expressionless, as though he had already made up his mind that Grace was unstable. But Grace couldn't let it go. The vision of her mother felt too real to be a simple trick of the mind. And the way Paul was acting, it just didn't feel right. Grace's suspicions were growing, and she knew she needed to find out the truth about what really happened to her mother. Grace couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside her. Paul's cold demeanor, the strange sounds at night, and the vision of her mother, it all weighed on her mind. She knew she had to dig deeper, even if no one else believed her. It started with a search through her mother's belongings. On August 10th, while sorting through Emma's desk, Grace stumbled upon an old folded letter tucked away in a drawer. It was dated almost a year before her mother's death. The letter wasn't long, but the words made Grace's heart race. In it, Emma mentioned problems with Paul, how he had become distant and controlling. Emma wrote about feeling uneasy around him, like she was being watched, though she didn't explain further. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Why hadn't her mother ever mentioned this to her? Grace couldn't confront Paul directly, not yet. She needed more information. So she turned to the internet, searching for anything about Paul's past. What she found left her more rattled than ever. Paul had been married once before, to a woman named Linda Charles, who had died in 2012. The cause of death? An apparent accident. Linda had fallen down a flight of stairs in their home. But as Grace dug further, she found old articles that suggested there had been whispers of foul play at the time, though no charges were ever brought against Paul. The parallels to her mother's sudden death were too eerie to ignore. Desperate for answers, Grace reached out to Detective Michael Klein, a retired investigator who had worked on Linda Charles's case. Klein was reluctant to discuss the details, but when Grace told him about her suspicions, he listened carefully. "Paul was always too smooth, too calm," Klein said. "We couldn't prove anything back then, but something always felt off about him." Encouraged by the detective's doubts, Grace started to notice other things. Paul had been quietly sorting through her mother's finances, selling off her artwork and consolidating accounts. Then, she started receiving strange text messages from unknown numbers. The texts were cryptic, warning her to stop asking questions. One even said, "Paul knows what you're doing." Grace was shaken, but more determined than ever to find the truth. Her mother's visions became more intense, appearing almost every night now. On August 14th, Emma's ghost appeared again, this time more urgently, mouthing the words, "He killed me." Grace's heart raced. Was her mother trying to warn her from beyond the grave? Was Paul responsible for more than just controlling behavior? Grace now had enough suspicions to believe that Paul might be hiding something. But she still needed proof, something concrete that could confirm her fears. She just had to figure out how to get it. On August 17th, Grace finally found the piece of evidence she had been searching for. While Paul was out for the afternoon, she snuck into his office. Her heart raced as she rummaged through his desk drawers, praying that she'd find something to confirm her suspicions. At first, she found nothing but old documents and financial papers. But then, in a locked drawer, she uncovered something that made her blood run cold. It was an insurance policy taken out on Emma's life. The document showed that Emma had signed the policy just 6 months before her death, with Paul listed as the sole beneficiary. The payout? Over $500,000. But something about the signature didn't seem right. Grace had seen her mother's handwriting 1,000 times, and this didn't look like Emma's. The loops were off, the pressure different, almost as if it had been forged. Grace's hands trembled as she realized what this could mean. If Paul had forged Emma's signature, had he planned her death all along? Was her mother's heart attack not an accident, but something much more sinister? Grace knew she had to act, but she didn't know whom she could trust. The first person she thought of was Detective Klein. She rushed to his home that evening, showing him the insurance policy. Klein looked at it closely and then nodded. "This doesn't look right," he said. "We might have something here. You need to take this to the police." But Grace hesitated. She knew going to the authorities meant involving Paul directly, and she wasn't sure what kind of reaction that would provoke. She feared for her safety. Paul had always seemed calm, but now Grace couldn't help but wonder what he might do if he found out she was onto him. That night, Grace barely slept. The weight of what she had discovered felt suffocating. The visions of her mother came again, but this time Emma's face was filled with urgency, her mouth forming the words, "Get out." Grace knew she was running out of time. The forged insurance policy, Paul's strange behavior, the cryptic messages, everything was pointing toward a dangerous truth. She believed Paul was not only responsible for her mother's death, but was also planning something even darker. The next morning, Grace decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront Paul, no matter the risk. But she would do it on her terms. She had to be prepared for anything, even if it meant facing the truth alone. Grace steeled herself for what was to come, knowing that whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. On the evening of August 18th, 2017, Grace could no longer ignore the mounting evidence against Paul. She had seen enough: the forged insurance policy, the eerie visions of her mother, the disturbing messages warning her to stop. Every part of her told her that Paul had been responsible for her mother's death, and now she feared for her own safety. She waited for Paul to return home that night, her mind racing. The house was dark and silent, the tension thick in the air. Grace knew that this confrontation could end badly, but she couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. When Paul finally walked through the door, Grace was ready. She stood in the living room, the insurance policy clutched in her trembling hands. Paul looked at her, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," Grace said, her voice shaky but determined. Paul's calm expression didn't waver. "About what?" he asked, setting down his briefcase with deliberate slowness. Grace held up the policy, her heart pounding. "This. I found it in your office." "This isn't my mother's signature, Paul. You forged it." "Why? What really happened to her?" For a moment, Paul didn't say anything. He just stared at the document in her hand, his face emotionless. Then a small, chilling smile curled at the corners of his lips. "You should have left this alone, Grace," he said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. "Your mother was weak, just like you. Always digging, always asking questions. But you don't know what you're dealing with." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The calm, composed man she had known for years had vanished, replaced by someone cold and menacing. She backed away slowly, but Paul stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "What did you do to her?" Grace demanded, her voice breaking. "Did you kill her?" Paul didn't answer. Instead, he lunged toward her, grabbing her by the wrist. Panic surged through Grace as she struggled to break free. In the chaos, she knocked over a nearby table, sending papers and objects crashing to the floor. She fought against Paul's grip, but he was too strong. Just then, something strange happened. From the corner of her eye, Grace saw the figure of her mother standing at the top of the stairs, her face filled with urgency. It was the clearest vision she had ever seen. Emma pointed toward the drawer by the kitchen. Grace broke free from Paul's grasp and darted toward the drawer, her hands fumbling as she pulled it open. Inside was a gun that Paul had kept hidden. Without thinking, Grace grabbed it and turned to face him. Paul froze, his eyes widening. "You don't have the guts," he sneered, taking a step toward her. But Grace didn't hesitate. 3 shots rang out, echoing through the house. Paul collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor. When the police arrived at the house just after 3:40 a.m. on August 19, 2017, they found Paul Barnett lying motionless on the floor. He had been shot 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the head. Grace was sitting on the kitchen floor, trembling, the gun still in her hand. She was in shock, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The officers quickly secured the scene and took Grace into custody. She was too shaken to speak, her mind racing with the images of the confrontation, the vision of her mother and the gunshots. As paramedics confirmed Paul's death, the investigation began to piece together what had led to this violent end. News of Paul's death spread quickly through the quiet town of Ashford. Neighbors were stunned. To them, Paul had always seemed like a calm and collected man. No one suspected anything sinister beneath the surface. Grace, meanwhile, was left grappling with what she had done. She had defended herself, but the reality of taking a life weighed heavily on her. Detectives began questioning Grace about the events leading up to the shooting. She told them everything: the insurance policy, the forged signature, the eerie visions of her mother, and her growing fear that Paul had been responsible for Emma's death. As more evidence surfaced, the police began to realize that Grace's actions may have been driven by much more than panic. The investigation would soon reveal dark secrets about Paul Barnett's past, secrets that would help explain why Grace had been pushed to such an extreme. Grace's trial began on April 2018, 8 months after that fateful night. The courtroom was packed with people from Ashford, all eager to hear the details of the case that had rocked their small town. Grace sat quietly at the defense table, pale and exhausted. Her defense attorney, James Reynolds, argued that she had acted in self-defense and that her actions were the result of months of psychological manipulation and fear. Reynolds painted a picture of a young woman cornered by a dangerous man who had planned her mother's death and was possibly plotting her own. He presented the forged life insurance policy as evidence, showing the court how Paul had planned to profit from Emma's death. Forensic experts confirmed the signature on the policy was not Emma's, adding to the suspicion that Paul had been involved in something far more sinister. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Laura Burns, argued that Grace had become mentally unstable after her mother's death. They pointed to her claims of seeing her mother's ghost as evidence that Grace had lost her grip on reality. Burns suggested that Grace's belief in these visions had led her to confront Paul, and that the shooting was a result of her delusional state. However, Detective Michael Klein was called to testify for the defense. Klein revealed his long-standing suspicions about Paul, including his involvement in the suspicious death of his first wife, Linda Charles. He explained how Grace had come to him with the insurance policy and her fears, and how the mounting evidence pointed to Paul as a dangerous man. The jury deliberated for 2 days, weighing the evidence and testimonies. In the end, on May 15, 2018, they returned with a verdict of not guilty. The court ruled that Grace had acted in self-defense, and the mounting evidence of Paul's dark past had been enough to raise reasonable doubt. Grace was free, but her life had been forever changed. The events of that night, and everything leading up to it, left scars she would carry with her for the rest of her life. After the trial, Grace Wilkins left Ashford, trying to put the nightmare behind her. She moved to a quiet town on the East Coast, far from the memories of her stepfather and the haunting events that had turned her world upside down. Though she was acquitted, the weight of that night still hung over her. She often spoke about her mother, saying she felt her presence during those terrifying moments, and she believed that Emma had somehow guided her through the ordeal. The town of Ashford, however, was left with lingering questions. How could a man like Paul Barnett, someone they had trusted, hide such dark intentions? Rumors spread about the Barnett house. Some said it was haunted, others believed it was cursed. Paul's past was scrutinized, and many wondered how close they had come to never uncovering the truth about his dangerous nature. Grace's case continues to captivate those who hear it. Was she truly defending herself, or had the stress and grief of losing her mother pushed her over the edge? The trial may have ended, but the impact of what happened will live on in the minds of those who followed the case. Thank you for watching this deep dive into Grace Wilkins's disturbing case. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Grace's actions were justified? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. And remember, stay safe and keep an eye on those around you, because you never know what secrets they might be hiding. And that's the disturbing story of Grace Wilkins and the tragic events surrounding her mother's death. What do you think? Was Grace truly acting in self-defense, or was the weight of grief and fear driving her actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think about this case. If you found this story intriguing, make sure to hit that like button, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the world of true crime. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe and take care.